And so this last section then of Lecture 5 is going to specifically look at human behaviors to examine the kinds of reciprocity that we're very likely to see among human populations. And so among humans, tit for tat reciprocity is one explanation for food sharing. So, there'll be a question on the exam that might say something along the lines of, why do humans share food? And then it's going to tell you to choose one particular explanation for human food sharing. And so one of those explanations that you could use is tit for tat reciprocity. And there are other explanations for human food sharing. One is kin selection. One is what we call tolerated theft, where humans share food not because they want to actively share food, but because the kinds of resources that they're consuming are not necessarily economically defensible. I mean, remember among hunter-gatherer groups, that we see, I mean, you're going to carry all of your wealth with you on your body. And so there's not really a benefit to saving up food over the long term because you don't have a place to keep it. You don't have a place to store it. Uh, and so it's better to share than it is to incur the cost of competitively defending that food. So that would be tolerated theft. And then we'll also talk about showing off, the idea that men pursue risky resources precisely because those resources are risky. And so in doing so, they are showing some measure of their physical prowess. They are showing their vigor. They are showing the fact that they're going to be able to adequately support a family. And so that would infer then that the benefit that they get from food sharing is along this avenue of mating access and increased reproductive success, rather than being directly related to survival of their offspring or something like that. So, looking at this tit for tat explanation or reciprocity as an explanation of food sharing is much more likely when food comes in large packages. Um, in packages that are large enough that you as an individual are not going to be able to utilize all that food. And so, of course, the kind of animals that humans preferentially hunt are large game. I mean, we're not going to really kind of focus on rabbits. I mean, we'll use small game as supplemental resources, but when we're interested in feeding a group, we're going to go for the largest game that we can possibly get. And so this might be in the African savanna, elephants, zebras, rhinoceros, giraffes, etc., things that are going to be able to feed really large groups of people. We should expect, if we're using tit for tat as an explanation for food sharing, that reciprocity is going to be more balanced among non-kin than among kin, because just like vampire bats had two rules of thumb: share with your kin, being kin is enough, and share with individuals with whom you form long-term bonds or alliances. So too are humans. For us, you're going to aid your kin in the quest for food merely because they're related to you. You're also going to aid your friends in the quest for food because you form these long-term affiliative kinds of bonds, and you have plenty of opportunities for reciprocity. The third feature with particularly human food sharing that indicates that reciprocity is perhaps an appropriate explanation is this idea of contingency. Among non-kin, people should give more to those from whom they receive more. That it's not just, okay, you shared with me, so I'm going to share with you. It also relates to the quantity of food that you share. And so if I share gathered carbohydrate foods with you, I share roots and tubers, you're probably not going to share meat with me unless it's this sexual division of labor and you and I are a mated pair, and our net household production is going to go towards feeding our offspring. So if I'm a male and supposed to be a hunter and I bring you a root or a tuber that my wife foraged and extracted, you're probably not going to share your meat with me. By contrast, if I share large game with you, um, frequently, then we've got this contingent relationship. You are likely going to also share large game with me frequently. That we give more to those from whom we receive more. We share more often with those with who share with us more often. And so we can see this both among hunter gatherers with respect to meat packages that are shared, but also among horticulturalists. I had already talked about this idea of reciprocity with the Aquana garden labor. So Roy Hames has looked at garden labor among the Aquana and the Yanomamo in Brazil. These are both hunter horticulturalists. That means that their carbohydrate resources come from things that they plant. Their protein resources come from active hunting. There is a sexual division of labor such that females are in charge of the gardening, males are in charge of hunting and politicking. And there's cooperative garden work where individuals will communally work in each other's gardens. So periodically you might help me in my garden, and in exchange I would help you in your garden. There are, again, two rules of thumb for the exchange of garden labor. One of those is the degree of relatedness. So if we are full siblings, you might often help me with my garden labor, particularly if we have an imbalance in kind of the demands on our time and our energy. So if you were my full sibling and I had already finished reproducing, I was postmenopausal, but you had 6 kids under the age of 6. Guess what? I'm going to help you in your garden quite often, versus if we both have a comparable kind of energetic burden. If we both have 6 kids under the age of 6, yeah, I'm not going to be free to help you. It might be our mothers who help us, etc. We see contingency then among non-kin such that in general, for every hour of labor that I give to you, you're going to give me an hour of labor in exchange. So when we look at this coefficient of relatedness between adults and we look at the absolute imbalance in labor given among individuals who are not closely related, we don't see an imbalance at all. For every hour of work that I do in your garden, you give me an hour of work in my garden. Among kin, as we move farther out along this degree of relatedness, so we're looking at 0.2 to 0.25 degree of relatedness. So we're talking about grandparents and grandoffspring. We're talking about half siblings. We're talking about aunts with their nieces and nephews. We are much more likely to find an absolute imbalance. So that means that among kin, we're going to do more things that kind of even out our energetic burden versus straight tit for tat reciprocity. So we still expect you to pay us back, but we don't expect you to pay us back in full. Among unrelated Yanomamo families, there is a positive correlation between labor given and labor received, such that we basically get a linear relationship that for every hour I give you, you give me one. And so in our discussion of food sharing, we see that there's this kind of relationship of contingency. And we really want to get at what is it about the foods that we share that are so key or so critical. Why do we have different rules about different kinds of foods, and different rules about really whom we're willing to share with. And so there's been a number of researchers, Kim Hill, Hilly Kaplan, Mike Gervin, and others, who have done mathematical modeling of human food sharing to really get at this why do humans share food question. And get an adequate answer that fully addresses the variability that we see in human food sharing. And so one of the factors that makes it more likely that we will share food is the variance or risk in going after said foods. And so here we have a hypothetical mathematical model looking at food that has 3 different kinds of return rates and what the effect of pooling resources or food sharing widely will have. So we've got three different probabilities of food. We've got food that's a probability of zero point 0.9. That means if you go out on 10 days, 9 of those days you'll come back with that resource. So that's a food that is fairly consistent and fairly reliable. This is going to be your gathered carbohydrates, right? You can always process palm fiber, or if you go out looking for palm nuts or other kinds of nuts, 9 times out of 10 you're going to come back with them. You know where to look, you know when to look. They're not a food that has a high degree of variability. By contrast, we've got hunted game. Here we've got one that's at this 0.4 level, that 40% of the time you're going to come back with food. So out of 10 days that you go out hunting, 4 of those days you're going to come back with something. This might be a hunted resource like armadillo, which harvesting armadillo isn't really, let's say, hunting per se, because armadillo are nocturnal, and what you're doing is you're digging them out of their burrows. And so really this idea of armadillo hunting is much more kind of extractive foraging. You know where to look for armadillo. Um, and so, therefore, you can fairly consistently get them. I mean, they don't necessarily always sleep in the same burrow. And of course, they're predated upon by other species. So you might go to a known armadillo burrow and not come back with armadillo because of them sleeping in a different spot, or the fact that the armadillos who burrowed in that burrow have been predated upon. And then lastly, we have a resource that's incredibly variable, that has only a zero point 0.1 probability of coming back with it. And so this is going to be something that you encounter only rarely. Let's say it's something like larger game like tapir or peccary. So this mathematical model is based on actual return rates from the Ache, the hunter-gatherers that were uncontacted in Paraguay until 1979, and were still using stone tools in 1979. And so with the Ache, using their actual return rates and the actual variance from some of the foods that they utilize, we can work out what our expected um, number of people pooling food should be. And we find that for those resources that everybody can get, you really should only have 1 or 2 people sharing food. And so these gathered carbohydrate resources that should be shared between 2 people, I mean, this reflects sexual division of labor, where females are gathering carbohydrates, males are hunting game, and that food, those gathered carbohydrates, are shared just within that household. These two that are hypothetical hunting return rates. The resource with a zero point 0.4 likelihood of success, the resource with a zero point 0.1 likelihood of success. I mean, these are going to be shared much more widely. And so if we look at the zero point 0.4, the optimal number of individuals pooling food should be about 5 or 6. Well, interestingly, um, because of this sexual division of labor, having 5 or 6 males pooling food means having 5 or 6 nuclear families pooling food. And this is the kind of optimal foraging band size, that in general, when the Ache are traveling together on this daily basis, it's about 5 or 6 males that pool their food together. It's about 5 or 6 males that are hunting together. The last one, this resource that has a probability of only zero point 0.1, there we don't, with this graph, even with 10 families pooling food, 10 males who are hunters pooling food, we don't reach that point where the curve diminishes. So with resources that are that highly variable that you rarely, if ever, have success, there shouldn't necessarily be a limit to the degree to which you share food. You should share that food as widely as possible, because let's say you have 10 hunters go out on any given day, only one of them is going to return with that resource. So share as widely as possible, ensure that you have access to that food. When we look at Ache food sharing, we can also look at this kind of the size of the package that we are hunting and what the effects are on food sharing. So here we've got two different what we call package sizes. We're looking at just basically weight of hunted game. We've got large package sizes and we've got small package sizes. A large package size here is going to be this greater than 4 kilograms. A small package size is going to be this less than 4 kilograms. When we look at the percent of acquisition that other nuclear families receive from individuals based on this package size, we find that small packages are only shared with really, really close families. So these rank of recipient nuclear families. Small packages smaller than 4 kilograms are only going to be shared with 2 or 3 other households, whereas these large packages might be shared with upwards of 10 other households. So, why do we expect to see this relationship? Well, package size relates to kind of this degree of assimilation, right? If you kill game that's incredibly large, you aren't going to be able to process the calories from that large kill. You've got kind of this cap on you and your family's energetic assimilation, the degree to which you can use those calories. So you kill something, there aren't giraffes in the New World, so the Ache would not be killing a giraffe. The largest thing they're going to kill is probably going to be a tapir or a peccary. But you kill something giraffe-sized, you're going to share it not just with your immediate group of 5 or 6 families with whom you travel, but you're going to share it across the band as well. And so later on, when we see Nice Story of a Kung Woman, you're going to see a giraffe hunt, and you're going to see that during this period before the Kung were settled into reservations, when something as large as a giraffe was killed, you shared this more widely than simply with your foraging band. You shared this across bands to distantly related kin that were in other foraging bands. When we look at the Ache sharing and we look at the percent that's kept within the nuclear family relative to the percent that's shared or given to other nuclear families, if you look at Paca and Peccary, even monkey and armadillo, you're giving away most of your food. The Ache are exceptional, though, remember, in their sharing patterns, such that they share absolutely equally with everybody when they're in this pre-contact kind of forest period. So they don't bias their kills towards their own nuclear family. They share everything evenly, and what this does is kind of equalizes everyone's energetic intake. It's kind of a communal living sort of setup where everybody is certain to eat because it doesn't matter who accessed food that day. There's going to be food available. But the Ache even share carbohydrate resources, and this is what really sets them off as an anomaly among human hunter-gatherer groups. For most other hunter-gatherer groups, you'll see the sharing pretty widely of meat resources, but not of carbohydrate resources. Here with honey, now honey is male acquisition because going after bees is dangerous. You can get stung, they attack. With honey, about 85% of what you would collect is shared, and only about 15% is kept in your nuclear family. But if you look at these collected carbohydrate resources, I mean, even for palm heart and palm fiber, you're sharing 69 to 72% of this. Now, palm fiber and palm heart, they're hard to get access to. Women have to cut down trees with stone-bladed axes to be able to get to cut the heart out or to process the palm fiber. So it's still labor intensive. It's still something that not everybody's going to be able to do. If you have infants nursing at the breast, you're not going to be able to chop down trees and cut out the heart of palm. Oranges are shared at 68%. Insect larvae are shared at 58%. Varella, which is a kind of fruit that is relatively ubiquitous on vines, that's not shared very widely. And the reason there is that anybody's able to access Varella. Even children can pick the fruits from these particular vines. And so we see, based on socioecological conditions, we see differences in this sharing continuum. And so much of what we're going to talk about this semester is going to focus firstly on hunter-gatherers, and then we'll get into how things change as we develop sedentism, as we develop agriculture, as we just develop um, unequal or inequity in access to resources, etc. If you look at the syllabus, we'll talk about reproduction, for example, in stratified societies. But we already see a big shift just in transitioning from foragers to horticultural groups. And why do we know this, and how have we studied it? Well, because most hunter-gatherers the world over today live in settled reservations. There's been a big push at the governmental level to give people access to shelter, to settle them into villages, give them access to houses, give them access to food that's grown versus food that's gathered or collected, give them access to medical care, give them access to schooling, kind of to equalize your population's access to these various um, kinds of amenities or resources. And so, among hunter-gatherer groups, or this kind of socio-ecological situation that would have characterized most of our evolutionary history, we were relatively egalitarian. That means everybody had a say in the group decision making. Our diet was large packaged and very unpredictable, which favored the evolution of food sharing. Production was coordination, luck, and work effort based. What that means is that you had to work together to get these protein resources. You had to work together, and you had to have some degree of luck, because you had resources that were incredibly variable that you weren't going to be guaranteed access to on kind of a daily basis. Group size was relatively small, only about 5 or 6 nuclear families. And if you recall back to that slide where we were looking at various return rates and the predictability or the probability of accessing a particular food, all you needed was a probability of only about zero point 0.4 to favor sharing with 5 or 6 nuclear families. So most hunted game is going to be characterized by that lower probability. So our group sizes map onto that accordingly. And then if you look at residence patterns, hunter-gatherers are typically nomadic. If they're sedentary, they may build structures, but those structures are relatively temporary, because if they face periods of food scarcity, they're not just going to sit there and starve. What they're going to do instead is pick up and move. And so they're very clustered in their campsites. They may not have any houses, or if they have structure at all or covering at all, it's temporary, like grass huts or animal hides spread over some kind of frame. Now, as we transition to horticulture, as we settle populations into reservations, as we get access to metal tools and see these people make this transition themselves, we see a big shift in the sharing continuum. Horticultural groups have small package sizes that are very predictable. You're gardening, right? You know when to plant, you know when to harvest, you know when you're going to have access to food, and you store it for those times when you don't. Production is independent. It's based on time and work effort. So it is your actual and your family's work in your garden that determines how much you produce, not really luck, right? I mean, there might be some aspect of luck with prevalent rainfall, but you're going to plant resources that you know generally the ecology supports. You're not going to plant something like, well, we shouldn't, right? Plant almonds in desert areas, because almonds require quite a bit of water. Similarly, there's not going to be this effort of coordination of multiple people's production, because it's your garden plot, and it's your individual work effort that's going to matter. Group size is large, greater than 20 nuclear families. Typically, horticultural groups live in villages that max out at about 150, 200 individuals. We'll talk why that is next week as we see these human quest films, but it has to do with what our brains are really able to keep track of. And so we see larger group sizes that allow us to perhaps protect us against endemic warfare, but we don't see the innovation of, let's say, the city-sized kinds of village sizes. We don't go much over about 200 individuals. And then residences are dispersed houses. You're able to start amassing stored resources because we're talking about sedentism. You're not going to move away from the area that you're gardening unless there's some extreme kind of chronic drought. So we see ownership of houses, we see ownership of resources, we see houses that are dispersed. Your house is going to be planted near your garden plots. So we're not going to quite be as clustered. We're not going to, everybody's not going to be able to see how much you're actually storing up. So we start to amass wealth. And so we see that egalitarian foragers share much more widely than horticulturalists. Though horticulturalists will share labor, will share work effort, as Hames was able to point out with the Yaquana and the Yanomamo. So that brings us to this question of, we evolved in this context of foraging bans. We evolved in this context of fairly widespread food sharing. Do we then have an evolved psychology that is focused on sharing? And I would say that it depends on what the resource is that we're talking about, that we do tend to be much more apt to share food itself than to share necessarily any critical resource that's necessary for survival. And so you can just think about what you're willing to give to panhandlers, right? Would you rather share actual food with panhandlers, or would you rather share money? Well, most of us would prefer to share actual food with panhandlers. And I've been known to carry granola bars and bananas around in my car specifically to hand out to anyone who has a sign that says that they're broke and hungry. I'd much rather hand out actual food than hand out money that might be used for some other purpose. And so to get at this question of whether we have an evolved psychology, we look to bargaining games. There are two economic games that are of particular interest to look for an evolved psychology of sharing, and that is the ultimatum game and the dictator game. And so the ultimatum game basically says that I'm going to choose two of you to play this game. I'm going to give one of you 10 monetary units, and then I'm going to ask that person that I give the monetary units to how much they're going to share with the other individual. The individual who's being shared with then gets the opportunity to either accept or reject that offer. And so when we see this game played with undergraduates that are your age, right? Young adults who are students at the university level, we see that they almost always offer an equal share. They almost always offer $5 so that each individual goes home with $5. When you only offer 4, you've got a lower rate of acceptance. You've got suddenly some people who will reject that offer. Now, if the offer is rejected, neither player gets those monetary units. And as you go even lower, the lowest offer that we see undergraduate individuals make is 3 monetary units, and that is only really offered about 10% of the time, and is rejected about half the time that it's offered. Now, the dictator game, by contrast, again, I pick 2 of you to play. I give one individual 10 monetary units, and they get to decide how to allocate those resources. There's no chance for rejection, though, so you as the recipient are stuck with what they offer. Interestingly enough, among university students, we still almost always offer close to equality. And so when university undergraduates play these games, they're going to offer 3 to 4 monetary units to the other individual. If we were really being a currency maximizer, right, when we play the dictator game, we should not offer anybody anything. We should take all of those monetary units. It's well within our right to take all of those monetary units, but that's not how we play. And so based on the patterns that emerged playing this game with undergraduates, it really did look like we have an evolved psychology for food sharing or for sharing in general. It really looked like we are just innate sharers. And so a bunch of economists wanted to look at how subsistence economies play this game to see whether there is an innate human psychology. And so they couldn't always play the game in the same way. But this game has been played with subsistence economies across the world. And so the premise is still the same. And these graphs show the results of the ultimatum game, where offers can be rejected. Um, but in some populations, if they were marketized, meaning that they grew cash crops and had local markets that they could attend to buy kinds of convenient goods, etc., then they tended to play this game much more like university undergraduates. If they had not yet been exposed to a market economy, their responses are really all over the board. And so, for those who had not been exposed to a market economy, you couldn't play for money. You had to play for cigarettes instead. So, there had to be slight changes made to the methodology here to make this game appropriate and kind of framed in a way that the people understood what they were doing. But if you look at this, they're really all over the board. I mean, you've got the Hadza that regularly, routinely make offers of only one or two of those monetary units, which here it was 100 cigarettes, so it's 10 or 20 of those cigarettes, and those offers are not rejected. So there's not this kind of sense of unfairness if somebody doesn't offer you close to half of that pot. When we look at groups in Kenya, they play it very much like university undergraduates do. When we look at groups in Zimbabwe, they routinely make really, really high offers. Here, offers of more than half, but they also reject really, really high offers. And so someone offers you 60% of the pot, you might question whether they've got ulterior motives, and you might be willing to reject that offer simply because you don't trust their intentions. And so, what does this show us? Well, this shows us that maybe we don't have an innate psychology, at least when it comes to monetary units or cigarettes. Okay, so because many of these groups that widely share food don't then demonstrate these same kinds of sharing behaviors when they're faced with something that's non-food, when they're faced with cigarettes, or they're faced with this kind of arbitrary concept of monetary units. So maybe we have an evolved psychology to sharing food that doesn't cross over into other kinds of resources. Maybe we don't have an evolved psychology at all, and our sharing behavior is very, very much based on socialization. Interestingly enough, the Ache are socialized from a very young age to share very widely. Kids are taught to start sharing earlier than 3, and by the time kids are 3 years old, they will equally share really any food that they're given. So socialization certainly plays a strong role. When you think about kinds of cross-cultural differences in how kids are reared, I mean, we're a relatively individualistic society when compared to places like China that are much more collectivist in nature. So in some respects, we're taught what's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours, or the rule of toddlers is what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. But we also then, in let's say school settings, encourage kids to share. So, share your toys, take turns, that kind of thing. So maybe our early childhood programs recognize that kids are not necessarily innate sharers, and then work on socializing that behavior for the good of the community or the good of the classroom. But the fact of the matter is, when we play these games, ultimatum and dictator game, with subsistence economies, they're all over the board. There's no kind of routine pattern that emerges. And so food sharing is a form of reciprocal altruism. But we have to recognize a couple of things. I mean, it's always facilitated by kinship. So how did food sharing get started? Well, it got started by sharing with your kin. It got started through kin selection. But then it's been reinforced and kind of applied at a broader level from these measures of reciprocity. In small band groups, small band systems with foraging groups, there is a high degree of relatedness. I mean, the Ache at this point of contact only had about 800 individuals in their entire meta population. So, of course, if you've only got 800 individuals, you're going to be pretty closely related. The degree of reciprocity then is able to be modulated or modified by relatedness. And so we saw this, of course, with the Aquana and the Yanomamo, that the more closely related you are, the higher the degree of imbalance you're willing to accept. The more distantly related you are, or if you're unrelated, you expect this tit for tat exchange. We also note that among humans, just like among other primates, we can see payback in other currencies. And the Vervet showed this with grooming and then aid when alarm calls were made or individuals vocalized that they were in distress. But the chimpanzees also showed this in a manner that may cross over to humans. The idea of men sharing or males sharing the resources they acquire in order to have access to females from a reproductive standpoint. And so this would be expected to dramatically increase fitness because obviously, if you're not having sex, you're not reproducing, meaning you're not leaving copies of your own genes in the next or subsequent generations. And so this payoff in other currencies gets at this show-off hypothesis that I mentioned, that this is why men don't specialize in rats. They go for things that are risky and hard to acquire and have a large degree of variance specifically for that risk. So they're able to show off some other, perhaps biologically based measure of quality. So you can be paid back in sex, you could be paid back in terms of favors to your children. The Ache, even though they share everything absolutely equally before they've settled into reservations, there's still, I mean, you might share pound for pound the meat, but there are some meats that are more valuable. Organ meats, for example, have a lot of iron in them, and so things like the heart and the liver might be considered more valuable than cuts from other parts of the bodies. That you might be sharing larvae, but you give someone's children the juiciest, fattest larvae, even though with respect to the number of larvae that are shared, everybody gets even. Um, and then prestige, the idea that men perhaps respond more to higher social status. So men might share not necessarily even to get paid back immediately in sex, but simply to gain social status. And so we have to ask ourselves, why do men respond more to social status? Well, we'll get to this when we start to talk about sexual selection and sexual dimorphism. Men can increase their reproductive success with any and every copulation, in theory, right? As long as those females are ovulating and not contracepting. So, by increasing the number of partners they mate with, which is facilitated by higher social rank, they're able to dramatically increase their fitness. Well, females aren't going to face that same gain. If you're pregnant and you have more sex, guess what? You don't get more pregnant. We are really constrained by resources and the energetics of reproduction versus just access to more and more mates. So, women may not inherently be as moved to pursue high social status. Unless high social status guarantees some measure of investment, which we'll talk about then as we branch into stratified social systems. Food sharing can also be a form of risk reduction. Think of it like an insurance policy. I mean, we all buy into health insurance not because we want to get sick, but because we want to be covered if we do get sick. And so this risk reduction kind of functions in that way. You know that the resources you go after are risky, and you're not going to get a return every day. So to guarantee that your family is going to eat every day, to guarantee that you are going to have access to enough calories when you've got a large number of dependents, a really large family, when you're sick or injured, you're going to share widely as this form of an insurance policy. We see food sharing as a division of labor between men and women, and also you can share food in order to get individual support in other avenues like defense against predation or alliance formation for conflicts with conspecifics. And then lastly, this idea of tolerated theft, of course, which I mentioned earlier, the idea that you share not because of any inherent benefit of sharing, but because the cost of competitively defending that resource would be too great. So you might as well get some kind of corollary benefit and make a show of food sharing versus incurring that energetic cost of defending that food. And so lastly, we're going to look at one idea here, the idea that we could be paid back in other currency, or this idea of a reputation. Right? You're able to get a reputation across various avenues. You may have a reputation for being a good hunter, that's independent of your reputation as relates to food sharing. And so Mike Gervin looked at this with the Ache in 2000 and published this idea of a reputation for generosity. Your reputation is part of your quest for status, but he chose reputation just because that's something you can actively cultivate. It's something that you focus on, that you want others to believe in you. So it's some measure that you cultivate, that you consciously try to generate in the minds of others. And so reputation for different traits may each lead to high status. So, in this context of food sharing, you could have a reputation as a high producer, but you could also have a reputation as one who shares generously. Individuals, so if you're sharing and trying to build this reputation, food sharing is going to be a signal of intent and quality. Individuals who consistently share food intensively signal a willingness to cooperate with specific partners. You're not just giving if we put it in monetary terms, you're not going to give 5 cents to 100 different people, right? You're going to be better off in terms of developing your reputation for being generous by giving larger quantities towards a smaller breadth of individuals. This intent could be useful for securing trade relationships, forming coalitions, generating allies in disputes. You want to share resources that are valuable. You're not going to share Barella, for example, right? Because anybody can go out and pick that. So you're going to share something that's costly to accrue, that's risky, that is therefore very coveted. And then you're going to be paid back during times of temporary disability or illness. Those individuals who have a reputation for being high producers and being generous are going to be more likely to receive help in the form of food or support. Now, is this a realistic risk? Yes. The Ache state that they are too sick or injured to go hunting on 30% of all days. If you at your job called in sick on 30% of all days, you would very, very quickly be fired, and develop a reputation as not having a good work ethic. So if the Ache are going to miss 30% of all days of hunting, it is a big, that's going to be a really, really, really big deal. That's going to be almost 100 days a year that they're not going to be able to generate resources for their families. That might be akin to these vampire bats that have a really high risk of starvation. Their reproduction is going to suffer, their survival is going to suffer if they don't have another way of feeding their families. And so Gervin then stratified people along two spectrums, along a production spectrum and along a sharing spectrum. So there are individuals who produce a lot or produce very little. There are individuals who give a large percentage of their individual production and those who give a small percentage. So if you produce a lot and give a large percentage, you are philanthropic. You're very generous. If you produce a lot but only share very little, you are classified as greedy. If you produce very little but share a large percentage of that, you get a reputation as a means-well individual. You just aren't that good at hunting. And if you produce very little and share very little, you are coded as a never-do-well. This was based off of It's a Wonderful Life and kind of the reputations that people generated in that holiday movie. And so then Mike observed actual aid that came to people during times of disability or illness. He looked at the number of people that gives to people of different reputations, the number of outside nuclear families that give to people with different reputations, the number of food items that are received, and then particularly the number of meat items that were received. And across the board, it was not your receipt of aid during times of need was not dependent on your actual production. If it were dependent upon your production output, then the philanthropic and greedy individuals would receive the same amount because they both produce at high levels. In reality, it is your reputation for sharing that determines your receipt and aid. And so the people who do best and receive aid when they're in need are those who are philanthropic or those who mean well. And so it is this reputation that you cultivate. It's being a generous person that matters more than being a high producer. So does it pay to be generous? Well, absolutely it does. And really, it's consistency in these shared relationships. It is not the breadth of sharing. You're not going to want to give, 5 calories to 100 different people. You would rather give 100 calories to 5 different people. It is the average number of families with which you share consistently more so than the breadth of your sharing. Sharing your individual production matters more than sharing families' production. So for men, it would matter that they share meat. For women, it would matter that they share carbohydrate resources. It's not that you share the resources that your spouse brought home. And greedy individuals may give more in terms of absolute amount that's shared, absolute number of calories that's shared, but they are less likely to receive assistance than the individuals who mean well, who are low producers but share a very large proportion of their production. So it is something that you can actively cultivate, and you can develop this reputation for being generous, even if you can't hunt with a darn, even if you're an overall low producer.